Whether you're new to the work or you're here to get cross-trained or you're a veteran just looking to get a little refresher, welcome. This pre-conference is going to be an introduction to many of the regulations of the AmeriCorps grant. We're going to go over a lot of stuff the next 2 days. You're not going to retain it all, and that's okay because we're available all throughout the program year. We also have a bunch of resources that we're going to point you to this week and next week during the conference. So don't feel like you have to write down a bunch of notes and remember everything, because yeah, it's going to be a lot. So today, in the next hour, we're going to talk through the basics. Lauren Troiano is going to walk you through all the basic terminology and definitions. Then after the question break, I'm going to come back and talk about some of the common problems we see so you can be prepared to do better. And then finally, we're going to wrap up before the break talking a little bit about the member contract, which is something that needs to be reviewed and signed with young people before you enroll them, and position descriptions.
So jumping into the content, the first thing I want to stop and talk about is a little bit of homework that we had asked everyone to do. With all of the information that got sent out to you, there was a link to a video that we asked everyone to watch before attending this session. So as a video on YouTube, Matt Clerico developed a lot of different resources earlier in the year, and he developed this crash course. And so we asked you to watch his week 1 video on eligibility. And I'm just wondering, to get sort of a feel, if everyone could find your chat box and just type yes if you were able to find that video and watch it before this session. I'm interested how many folks, okay, I'm seeing a bunch of yeses come in. Awesome. Okay, great. So that's great. So Matt really set us up. I'm not going to be going over everything that Matt talked about in that video. That really was sort of step 1. I'm going to be picking up from where he left off. If you didn't get to watch that video, this is just a plug to go back and watch it. The link for it is right in the agenda that you got in order to sign into this session. The other bullet point on this slide is just pointing you towards the CNCS CHC e-course, which is always a part of Grant Startup, which we're in the middle of right now. So it's a CNCS learning resource and an e-course that you take. So we'll be talking about you taking that as a part of Grant Startup, but mostly I'm going to be talking about that crash course video. All right, Clerico, will you go to the next slide for me? All right, so in that video, if you watched it, this should look familiar. Matt introduced us to this flow chart, which follows our entire paperwork journey for Youth Build AmeriCorps members throughout their entire term of service at your program, which I know this can be a little bit overwhelming. So we are going to break this apart throughout the 4 sessions this week, today and tomorrow, and take each chunk one at a time. This week, we're just going to be focusing, and if you click once, Matt, Matt and I are just going to be focusing on the top row of this, as you see outlined here. So this session is just going to cover this top row. And if you go forward one more, these first 2 boxes, again, this is what Matt covered in the first video that we asked you to watch beforehand. Matt talked about the application. He introduced eligibility and what that means in AmeriCorps, and he covered the first 2 parts of eligibility, citizenship and age. So again, hopefully that's a good refresher for all of you who watched the video. You're remembering seeing all of that. Again, if you haven't, please do go back and watch it, because I'm going to be picking up from where he left off and talking about the 3rd part of eligibility, which is the CHC process. So if you move forward, we're going to start with super basics. What are we talking about when I say NSCHC? So the acronym itself stands for National Service Criminal History Checks. And what we mean when we talk about this in AmeriCorps is actually a very specific 3-part process used to determine eligibility to serve in AmeriCorps. So it's not just a general catch-all term like background check. It really is a very specific outlined process in CNCS regulations. And of course, in this presentation, we're going to dive into these parts. So what are the 3 parts? The 3 parts of an AmeriCorps NSCHC starts with another acronym, NSOPW. You'll hear us say this a lot. It stands for National Sex Offender Public Registry Check. And then also a state check, as well as an FBI check. So those are the 3 parts, NSOPW, state, and FBI. All right, who needs an NSCHC? Those are the three parts. Who needs these checks done? So anyone in a covered position. So this is CNCS's term. And I guess I should pause for a minute and just make sure everyone knows when we say CNCS, another acronym, we're talking about the Corporation for National and Community Service, our main funder. Their definition for a covered position is anyone receiving a salary, stipend, living allowance, or education award on a CNCS grant. So to dive into this a little bit more, what this means, all members, any member that you're enrolling into an AmeriCorps slot absolutely needs a CHC run. Additionally to that, any grant supported staff. And what this means is when a staff person at your program is listed on your AmeriCorps budget. It doesn't actually matter what their job title or function is, differentiating between your AmeriCorps coordinator who's always with your members and an accountant who hardly ever sees your members. It really just matters who the staff people are who are listed by name on your AmeriCorps budget. If they are on that budget, either on the expense or match side, they need to have an AmeriCorps approved NSCHC on file. So what are we looking for? We know the three parts now. We know who needs these checks. The two things that you see on your screen here are the only reasons we're doing these three checks. These are the only two things that could come up in all three parts of these checks that would disqualify somebody from being enrolled into AmeriCorps. Okay, a murder conviction or being registered or required to be registered as a sex offender. So it's important to realize from the start, we know that young people coming into a youth build program might be nervous when they hear that you're going to be running criminal history checks. And so it's important to know that a lot of what might come up on a criminal history check as results wouldn't actually disqualify them from being enrolled in AmeriCorps. It's only these two major offenses that would be automatic disqualifiers. So how are we going to run these checks? This has gotten a little bit simpler, I guess, in some ways. There are two approved, CNCS approved vendors now that the vast majority of our programs are using to run all three parts of the criminal history check. I will say from the onset, there's a chance you're at a program that has a waiver to use a different system. But if that's the case, you're just going to talk to your portfolio manager about that and we'll make it a lot more clear. For the most part, all of our programs are using two approved vendors. And the first one is called TrueScreen. TrueScreen is the vendor that you're going to use to run your NSOPW and state check. Okay, this is a name-based search. It requires the member to go through an online setup process and it provides conviction data when applicable. I'm going to go in more depth about what the TrueScreen process looks like. Right now, just know this is the online system that you're going to use to run the NSOPW and state portions of the NSCHC. I'm going to touch on this really briefly here. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth, but what we do want you to be aware of is if, depending on the state where your program is, it may be that you don't actually have to run a state check in TrueScreen. You may just be running an NSOPW. And the reasons for this are varied and complicated, and I'm not going to bother touching on them, but you can see the different states that are listed on this screen. Just know that it might be you only have to run an NSOPW in TrueScreen. And as you have questions about the specifics, that's what we're here for. So the third part of our NSCHCs are the FBI checks. To run those checks, we're going to use a separate online vendor called FieldPrint. So yes, you're going to have another login, another account with FieldPrint. This is the online vendor that you're using to run the FBI check. The FBI check is a fingerprint-based check, whereas TrueScreen was name-based. With FieldPrint, you're actually scheduling appointments for your young people to go to a live scan location and get their fingerprints done electronically. And again, I'll dive into more details about each of these processes coming up. Okay, so timing. When does this all have to happen? So the NSOPW and state check must, absolutely no wiggle room, must be completed prior to starting service. So you're going to complete the entire TrueScreen check for the NSOPW and state before you enroll a member into eGrants. A really important part. We recommend that you follow those same guidelines for the FBI field print check as well, that you wait for that check to be complete before you start a member service term. However, it is allowed that you could just initiate the FBI check, and that would allow you to enroll the member. We're seeing this come up more and more this year. During COVID-19, programs have found that field print locations have not always been open. And CNCS really wants to make sure that that's not going to stop programs from enrolling members and starting their service terms. So in order to understand this more, let's talk about what initiation means. Okay, so initiation, according to CNCS, again, is one tangible, documentable step beyond getting consent. And since, again, most of us are talking about field print, we'll boil this down for what that means in the field print system. And it means setting up or scheduling and then documenting that field print appointment. So one concept that Matt Clerico introduced us to in that video we asked you to watch before this is a tagline we use a lot in our network: if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. So it's an important thing to keep in mind along this process. So once you've scheduled a field print check, which I'll talk a little bit more in depth about in a minute, you get an appointment confirmation. And as soon as you have that confirmation that you can print out as documentation, that is your initiation step for the FBI check. So I'm going to go through the TruScreen process as well as the field print process. Before I do that, I just want to say from the start, we don't expect you to remember all of this right now at all. This is really, you have to log in and do it for the first time, ask us a bunch of questions. We expect that. This is really just to give you a feel for what these vendors require and what to kind of think about and plan for the first time you're going to run a check in these systems. So again, when we're talking about TruScreen, we're talking about the NSOPW and the state check. So as a staff person, you're going to have an administrative login account in TruScreen. You're going to go in and you're going to order a check for a young person, which really just means entering their name and email address. Because the second step that happens is that that individual applicant gets an email and they need to create an account. So this is the important part to realize about TruScreen. For the good and the bad, it takes a lot of member involvement. They need to be a part of this process. So what a lot of our programs have learned is that it's best to do this when a member is with you in the office and help guide them through this so that you can help them make sure they can log into their email account, click on that email, set up their account. And as you can see in step 3, it asks them to complete a lot of identification forms. It asks them to enter a lot of identification information that you want to make sure they're entering really accurately. You also need to upload a copy of their government issued photo ID, which again, as you learned from Matt Clerico in that first video, is something that you're already collecting and keeping on file. So again, it's a good opportunity for you to just be able to upload that with them if you're helping them with this process. And then this is also where TruScreen automatically collects consent from young people. They sign agreements and disclosures as part of this process online to give their consent for these checks to be run. So once you help them with all of that, TruScreen is going to automatically run all of the checks for you. Make sure everything is done correctly the way it needs to be. Within 1 to 3 business days, you're going to get the results back. The important thing in TruScreen to understand is that there's one final step. You need to adjudicate these checks in the TruScreen system. So once the checks are returned, you're going to go into your account, click on the member's name, and there's a final checkbox that you need to check off to say that you have actually reviewed and you're adjudicating those results. Okay, so it's just an important thing to realize that's the step that makes it complete. So that was TruScreen. Again, TruScreen, NSOPW, and state. Moving into field print, again, we're talking about the FBI check, which is a fingerprint-based check. So here, what you're doing as a staff member is you're signing into your account and you're scheduling actual appointments for young people. So you're finding the nearest live scan location to your program and you're scheduling individual appointments for each member who needs to have an FBI check run. And again, call back to what I talked about a little earlier, that's your initiation step, right? Scheduling that appointment, you pay for it, you get a confirmation of the date that you set that appointment for. But then, of course, you have to follow up on this, right? So you need to actually get that applicant to the live scan location so that they can have their fingerprints done. It's an electronic fingerprint system. Once you're there, you give the members information. It's all of about 5 minutes. Once that's done, you're going to receive an email when the check is complete. Log into the client portal and review the results. For field print, when we're talking about results, we really are just talking about you either get a cleared or a not cleared as a result. And most of the time, it's just going to say cleared. What's different here to understand is that you don't adjudicate anything for field print within field print. You use the EVF to adjudicate these checks. Who remembers what EVF is? I'm realizing there's an acronym on the screen there. Does anybody remember? Matt Clerico introduced this in that video. When I say you adjudicate the FBI check on the EVF, does anybody remember what that stands for or what that is? And if you do, type it into the chat box. So, eligibility verification form is what EVF stands for, a really important form in our paperwork process where you're going to document all different parts of eligibility. Again, Matt introduced it in that video, went over the first part of it, and he's going to call back to some other parts of the EVF in the later part of this presentation. But there's a box right on there where you're going to enter in the dates and the fact that you reviewed the results of your field print FBI check. A really important part of this process, as well as TrueScreen, is the fact that you need to retain documentation for these checks. Again, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Okay, so you need to be printing off the summary pages for these checks, keeping them on file along with your EVF. And again, later in the presentation, Matt's going to show some examples of what that documentation should look like. How often do you need to get these? We've gone over how to do them now, who needs them, when they need to happen, but how often do you need to be running these CHCs? And the good answer here is almost all of the time, this is a one-time process. You are doing this prior to enrolling somebody in AmeriCorps, and once it is complete, that is the only time you need to do it. Once you enroll a young person, there's no reason to rerun a criminal history check. The only time you might need to is if a young person completes one term of service and wants to re-enroll in a second term of service. If the gap in time between the end of the first term and the beginning of the second term is longer than 120 days, that is the only time where you're going to have to rerun a criminal history check for a young person. If the gap of time is less than 120 days, you still don't need to rerun. It's still a one-time process. So that is the good news about CHCs. You just have to get it right once.
So, potential areas of risk. How to mess this up. So, we do a lot of review and we do a lot of monitoring, whether it's desktop monitoring in this area, era of COVID, where we're asking you to send things in so we can double check them, or when travel resumes and we come out and visit your program. It's in all of our best interest that we're all doing this right. There are a lot of penalties and there's a lot of risk involved with criminal history checks. So yeah, we see a lot, and all the things that go wrong fall into the same kind of buckets. So we're going to talk about each one individually because we want to set you up for success. And maybe you're not the person who's running these checks at the program, but this is everybody's job. So if you're aware of some of the common areas where we can screw up, maybe you can prevent it next time. Okay, so number one is not running the check on time. This is super important, especially these days. We're going to get into eGrants enrollment later, but you have to certify that you have done this before you enroll a young person into the AmeriCorps system. And even though that's meant to catch a lot of these timeliness issues, we still see this from time to time. The NSOPW check and the state check must be completed before you enroll someone as an AmeriCorps member. So even if, things are in process, you've got to hold off on that enrollment until all those checks are done. As we're saying, and as we'll expand upon next week, the FBI check can be initiated before someone's enrolled. Not necessarily complete, but it's best practice to make sure that it's all done whenever possible. So that's the number one. What's number two? Getting the name wrong. So we used to see this a lot more often. TrueScreen, I feel, solves a lot of these problems, but the name needs to match the government issued photo ID. So I get a lot of questions, we get a lot of questions about, well, my young person brought in 3 or 4 documents and they all have different names. Which one do I go with? Well, the rule is go with the most recently collected one, the most recently created document, and that's going to be that government issued photo ID. When you go to put someone into TrueScreen, you're putting in their first name and their last name, never their middle name. If you have a young person with many names and you need to navigate that, give us a call and we can figure that out on a case-by-case basis. But it's got to match that photo ID exactly, or it's not a correct check. So that's very important. Not checking the ID in the system. So for TrueScreen, you're going to be uploading a screenshot of that ID. And that's part of the process. You're not going to get the result unless you do that. But you need to also check that ID to make sure it's the person. Federal eligibility, you're going to be signing off on the front page of that EDF, the EDF where you've seen the photo ID, you've seen the proof of citizenship, social security card, all of that. So yeah, you want to make sure we're checking the IDs that it's actually the person that we're running this check on. And then this is a common one too, especially with these new vendors, is failure to adjudicate. So in TrueScreen, you're going to get a recommendation back after you order that check. That is not the result. The result needs to be reviewed by a staff person at your program and then approved, right? And that's adjudication. And when you do that, it actually puts a timestamp on it. So when we're doing our reviews for compliance, or maybe we're reviewing some staff checks for reimbursement through this grant, that's what we're looking for, is that timestamp. So yeah, that recommendation that returns, that's not sufficient. The process isn't done until you adjudicate and get that timestamp. And for field print, you're going to get a clearance result, but you need to adjudicate that as well on the eligibility verification form. You need to be involved in the process. It's not just handing this work off to vendors and hoping they get it right. So yeah, getting that cleared recommendation is not enough. We want to see that you've checked it, or a staff person at your program has checked it and adjudicated that result. All right. And then not maintaining documentation. So LT touched on this a little bit. So TrueScreen is supposed to keep the documentation for 7 years. It hasn't been 7 years since we adopted it, so we're not really sure if that's going to happen or not. And FieldPrint only keeps it for a couple of years. So again, it's only documented when you've printed it off or screenshotted it. If you want to save paper, you need to have a record that check being done, and that needs to be stored somewhere else than the vendor's system. So yeah, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. This is what we're looking for: 2 pieces of paper, 2 screenshots, one from TrueScreen. So this is what we're seeing on the side. I don't know if I have controls to indicate things, or if you guys can see my mouse. You can, great. So this is that timestamp I was talking about, right? There's going to be all this information. Obviously, we want to see names, and we want to see dates that you ordered the check. But really, when I'm reviewing a TrueScreen check, this is what I'm looking for: that your staff member on February 21st, 2019, adjudicated this TrueScreen result as a pass. If I see that, then I know that that's okay, provided that that's before the enrollment date. And then here on the field print check, we're looking for the fitness determination. So we're looking for cleared, obviously. Sometimes you get not cleared. If that happens, get in touch with us, because that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody can't join your program, but that's a process we'll have to work through. And then we're also looking at dates. So field print is kind of great. It gives you a whole list of when the appointment was made, when things were transmitted to the FBI, when the FBI returned their results, and when the results were received back at the program. So we're looking for the dates and the cleared determination here. Again, they're going to send you a lot of things. We don't need to see all those things. We need to see these 2 pieces of paper or screenshots. Okay, so then getting back to the EVM. Now that you've seen all the results and you've printed them off or saved them on your computer, you're ready to complete the eligibility verification form. So there's a couple boxes you're going to check and then you're going to sign off on it. So we're going to talk about the boxes first. So the first box says, in alignment with Youth Build USA's accompaniment policy, the above individual did not have access to vulnerable populations until all 3 parts of the NSCHC were returned, reviewed, and adjudicated. That's a lot. So let's break that up a little bit. First off, what's a vulnerable population? Well, a vulnerable population is who we're trying to protect by running these checks and putting the young people through all of these processes. Vulnerable populations are those 17 years or younger, so children, minors, individuals 60 or older, or seniors, and then individuals with disabilities. So this is really about service recipients. These are the people out in the community that your students, your young people, are going to be interacting with their service. That's who we're trying to protect. It doesn't include other covered positions. So, maybe you have a geriatric staff member, or maybe you have some other young people in the building that are under 17. That's not what these regulations are concerned about. Again, we're concerned with the people who are going to be receiving the service out in the community. So CNCS recommends that every position description, and LT is going to talk about those in a minute, addresses how each one of these members is going to interact with vulnerable populations in the community. So the template position description, which many of your programs are working on right now as part of their grant startup, they use a template that we provide that has that language in it. So yeah, we want to make sure we call that out because that's a big concern. So another part of that same checkbox statement is accompaniment policy. So Youth Build USA as a network, or Youth Build AmeriCorps as a network, has an accompaniment policy that is actually informed by programs. So let's talk about that a little bit. What's accompaniment? So accompaniment is members whose checks are still in process, who have pending checks. They can't be exposed to vulnerable populations unless they are accompanied. Accompaniment being in the physical presence of someone who's been cleared for access to that population. So this could be a staff member at your program that we've already cleared for reimbursement. If you have healthcare members, this could be a nurse at the service site. But this isn't just supervision. This is being in the constant physical presence of someone who, again, is cleared and can sign off that, they accompanied this person because they're not cleared to work with that vulnerable population yet. And that accompaniment has to be documented. It's not impossible, but it is tricky. So again, back in 2014, we did an assessment of criminal history checks. Actually, CNCS did an assessment of all AmeriCorps programs. And our part of that was working with Youth Build AmeriCorps programs to figure out what our policy on accompaniment would be. And what we heard from programs back then, and I feel is still true, is that, look, while these young people are running through these processes, they're getting their OSHA 10, they're doing their CPR training, they're being oriented. So they're really not out in the community just yet interacting with vulnerable populations. So our stance as a network, again, informed by programs, is that members will just not have access to vulnerable populations until all the checks are received and reviewed for eligibility. Now, does this mean you can't have a service project during mental toughness? Absolutely not. That's a great way to introduce service to young people, but maybe not at a school. Certainly not at a senior center until, again, all of these people are cleared, or you can both provide accompaniment and then document it correctly, which again is a little tricky. Getting past all that, you're going to check that box, and then we're going to review the results. We want to provide reasonable opportunity for the subject of those checks to review them. So whether that's the young people asking to see their results or a staff member wanting to review them, you have to make that available. Sometimes these aren't accurate for one reason or another, and things need to be cleared up. And then you either deem them eligible or ineligible. If it's ineligible, you're going to put all this paperwork in a file, you're going to keep that. But yeah, we're really concerned with the ones that are going to be enrolled into AmeriCorps. So yeah, eligible, we're going to check off that box, and then we're going to sign this part of the form. Again, the form has two sides. One side is all about age and citizenship, and you're going to sign that probably well before you enroll them as an AmeriCorps member, because you're doing that as part of the intake process. The other side needs to be signed on a different date, which is after all of these checks have been returned and reviewed and adjudicated. So we look for the difference in those dates. It's very important.
So once we've gotten the CHCs taken care of, the member contract is a really important document we need to go over. It's something else that needs to be signed. Again, this is all leading up to a member start of service, so this needs to be completed before you even enroll a young person. So this is a document that all of your programs already have. It's a template that we came up with, and it includes all of the required language from the federal regulations. Some specific areas of content here to know exist in this contract. First of all, consent for the NSCHC checks. At this point now, as we've mentioned, TrueScreen and FieldPrint actually include gathering consent from the young people, but it's still in this contract as an extra document where they're signing off on their consent to that process. A really important part of the contract are the grievance procedures that are outlined here. It includes time limits and binding arbitration. It's important not only for staff to become familiar with all of the parts of this contract, but also for you to decide the best way of talking this through with all of your young people. This is going through all of the rights and responsibilities, both of your young people and the program. So your members need to understand if they have an issue or grievance with your program, what's the right process for airing that? Who do they talk to? What do they do? The contract also goes through their civil rights, goes through non-discrimination policies. It goes through the terms and benefits of their term of service. So their start date, how many hours, what's their slot type, and how many hours are they required to earn. And if they successfully earn those hours, what is the amount of the education award that they are earning? Any other benefits to service, depending on the slot type they're in. And it also has a member media release. If you're going to take photos of service events that your members are taking part in and you want to share those photos on social media or any of your materials, there's a member media release as part of this contract built in. So this is updated every program year. You need to personalize it to your program. There are parts that you need to personalize. But most importantly, it has to be both reviewed as well as signed off on by both staff and members. So we encourage, and most of our programs will build in some sort of AmeriCorps orientation to your mental toughness or to the beginning of an AmeriCorps member's term. And you want to take the opportunity during that time to walk step by step through this contract so that everyone understands all of the pieces and what they are signing off on. No matter what, the member and the staff person are signing off on the last page of this contract. There's a spot for both of those signatures and dates. But also, if we're talking about a young person who is under the age of 18, we need to be collecting parental consent as well. And there's a spot for that built right into the same page, last page of the contract. So obviously, if the individual signing the document is 18 years of age or older, you just don't need to use that parental consent section. However, we know more and more programs are enrolling more individuals under that age. And so if that's the case, you need to get a parent or a legal guardian to sign this contract as well. And just like the other signatures, it needs to happen before you enroll the member in AmeriCorps. Okay, so then position descriptions, arguably maybe one of the most important parts of the contract. So some programs have the position description embedded right into the body of a contract. In most cases, though, there's a section of the contract that lists the position description as an addendum or an attachment to the contract. So it ends up being its own document, but it's really important that this document is actually always attached to the contract, printed out and reviewed just like that contract with the young people when they're signing the contract. So the position description is the document that goes into a lot more depth about what the member is actually going to be doing as an AmeriCorps member at your program. Okay, so it goes over some basic qualifications, again, some of the benefits of their term of service. It dives into supervision. So how is this member going to be supervised? Who is their supervisor? They need to know that, obviously, at the onset of their term of service. But then it lists out the service activities, and that's really the most important part of the position description, is listing out the approved service activities that these members are going to be doing to earn their AmeriCorps hours. So the important thing to understand is that you may have multiple position descriptions at your program. We need to collect position descriptions for every type of service track. So while everyone has a construction track, we know more and more programs have non-construction service tracks. If you have construction and community health and wellness at your program, we need separate position descriptions for both of those tracks that identify the service activities those members are going to be doing. Similarly, for different slot types, for instance, most of our members are quarter-time members, working to earn 450 hours, but we also have full-time members in our network, and they of course need their own specific position descriptions outlining what they will be doing. They also have different benefits that need to be listed as their full-time members, and they need to follow along with whether they're a teacher's aide, construction assistant, volunteer coordinator, community partnerships, full-time member. It needs to be clear in their position description what exact activities they're going to be doing to earn their AmeriCorps hours. And this is also the document that helps start to differentiate AmeriCorps time for young people from the start, right? They're signing a contract for their AmeriCorps term of service. They're reading through a position description to understand what activities at the Youth Build program are their AmeriCorps activities to help them earn that education award. So a really important document. You're using a template that we create every year to write out your own position descriptions. And this is something we're doing right now. So we actually collect and review all of your position descriptions each and every year as a part of what we call grant startup. And that's what's happening right now, right? Our current grant year ends on August 14th. The new grant year starts on August 15th. This is the time of year. Every year we talk to all of our programs about updating their position descriptions, actually sending them to your portfolio manager so we can review them, talk to you about them, ask you if we have any questions, and then we keep them on file. So there's a lot of opportunity to talk about this particular document because it's so important with us at this exact time of year. So you'll be hearing a lot about position descriptions in the next few weeks.